So welcome to our little session. I have with me Professor David Harradine, who is an interdisciplinary artist and academic, currently serving as Professor of Interdisciplinary Practice at Royal Central School of Speech and Drama. He is co-founder and co-artistic director of Feathered Sleep, a company known for creating performance, film and visual art that engages with themes such as grief, participation and accessibility. His work is deeply research-led and participatory, crossing traditional boundaries to bring art into everyday spaces. He also mentors and supervises PhD students and really bridges that gap between academia and professional practice. David's here today to introduce and talk about the Central School of Speech and Drama's REF submission and the practice boxes. And when I first was shown these, I came across a video, or a colleague at work showed me this video and challenged me to create one. So can you do one of these? And so I actually had to go and mocked one up. And even just putting one together was a really interesting experience and process of just gathering and reflection. But the key thing here is that this was put together as a submission for the REF 2021. Mm-hmm. So we're going to explore this idea of practice boxes and what they are and what their value is perhaps to institution and creative practice researchers. So, David, what is a practice box?
Thanks, Roy. These kinds of things, they're a format which we developed at Central, and I think it's worth saying a little bit about Central actually.
Okay, yes,
but maybe I'll start with that because I think it is relevant to why these came about. So my academic job is at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, University of London. So it's a University of London college. But historically, it's a drama school. It's a theatre and actor training drama school. And I think joined the university, probably in the 90s when all the shifts happened from the kind of college to university colleges. So its roots are in practice. Fundamentally, it's a college where practice happens, where practice is taught, where theatre techniques are taught, both as performers and makers. And there's a very large number of professional practitioners who work at Central teaching and then practicing as artists, makers elsewhere. That was part of the University of London. Central also, of course, is really significantly engaged in research. And because most of the members of staff who are at Central are connected to the theatre training side of things, almost all the researchers are practitioners. There are researchers absolutely who write and publish text, books, but most of the researchers at Central are practice researchers, including myself. So when we had to prepare the submission for REF 2021, there was this challenge that we felt, which was, given the significance of practice research at this institution, how could we present and represent that in an exercise like REF in a way where it felt like practice research had an equal kind of weight and rigor and standing in terms of being recognised as significant and high quality research as those published outputs that are more recognisable. A monograph is really recognisable as a substantial piece of work. It's more difficult to see a piece of creative practice because creative practice is always already doing something else as well that isn't just about making the research visible, and I think we can talk more about that. So the way that we approached that was to produce these boxes. It's a format that we developed. Really, they're containers, and I can talk through what they contain. They're kind of like a portfolio. So they recognise the practice is complex and heterogeneous and multifaceted. And they're kind of a portable repository on the scale of a project. Like there are, there are 21 of them. We submitted 21 of these boxes, one for each of the 21 practice research projects that went into REF. These are the 3 that I produced, and they all follow the same format. And I think there's an opportunity to talk more about the specifics of that, but just very quickly to show you what's inside them. It's a box.
Lovely box.
It's a lovely box. Yeah, I mean, there's something about the materiality of most practice, and certainly at Central, most practice, because it tends to be an embodied practice. There's something about the materiality which was important as a starting point. So they each contain a booklet which each researcher wrote about their practice project, which is like a very, very extended version of the 300-word statement that had to be written for each ref output. The actual 300-word statement is printed on the inside lid of the box, and this is a substantial extension of that goes into much more detail. We can come back to that. They have a little USB for digital content, and then they're a box, and everyone put different things in their box. So this, one of my projects called This Grief Thing, was a collection of clothing for people who are grieving, clothing and accessories for people who are grieving. So it's like a contemporary reimagining of mourning dress, where we opened pop-up shops and people could take away these clothes. So I've got some clothing in my box. A scarf and a t-shirt and some badges and brooches, and each one's got different things. And one of my colleagues at Central worked with VR, and her box had a VR headset, and her ref submission was mostly on the VR headset. And so we invited the assessors to wear it as part of the assessment of that project. So yeah, they're a format, a container, a portfolio, a repository, which attempted to give these very diverse practice-based projects a presence, I mean, like a literal presence, like in the ref warehouse, where things are getting delivered to the ref warehouse, so there's stacks of books and stacks of journals. And all ref really wanted, I think, for practice research was a 300-word statement.
Yeah.
So we wanted to make something that felt as substantial as the more, I guess, traditional written outputs that were being assessed and submitted.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the booklet? Because one of the interesting things about the booklet, when you open it, it is a treatise on the methodology, but it's also illustrated. Yeah. So there's further opportunity to unpack or present the work that was produced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we can talk. It'd be great to talk and think together about what practice research is doing other than research, because I kind of made a statement around that at the beginning of this conversation, and I feel there, certainly in my work and certainly with my colleagues at Central, where people are theatre makers, opera designers, scenographers, installation artists, interdisciplinary artists, we're all artists, we're all making things, and usually in contexts which are not academic contexts, so in public contexts, in theatres, in galleries, in making public art, making all sorts of projects that function in contexts that are not academia. Mm-hmm. And those projects have to function well in those contexts. Like, everyone wants to make good work. We all want to make good projects that are good as the things that they are in the world as pieces of kind of art or practice. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting tension there, and it's come up a couple of times where people have said it doesn't matter if the work is good, it's the research that's important, but there is a context that if that work is being presented to the public, then there has to be a quality in terms of the experience of the public as well. So it is trying to do two things.
Yeah, and I really strongly think that those two things are not mutually exclusive. The quality of practice or art making, if you call it that, and quality of research don't need to be in tension with each other. But I think may I just finish can I just finish my train of thought so I don't lose it, and then sorry to make you wait just a little bit. Thank you. And so, I guess my point is in trying to make projects that function on the basis, we all set out the terms that we want to make. We have an idea, we have a way of kind of developing and executing that idea, and we follow that through. And that isn't always about making research legible. It's not about making your research questions legible, it's about making your methodology legible, or making your findings legible necessarily. And so there's a huge problem around something like REF in terms of practice research or certain kinds of practice research, because legibility and kind of clarity is so important. And so that was a very long and circuitous kind of beginning of an answer about these booklets, because what these booklets try and do is tell their narratives, they tell the story of the project, and they're really simple. They're kind of like a social science approach. They're just a very simple, almost chronological narrative of the project from conception, like a problem, an area of inquiry, an area of practice, a kind of practice. They kind of lay out research questions, they describe the methodology, they talk about partnerships and audiences and settings and contexts. They describe what was discovered, like you made a collection of clothing and opened some pop-up shops, great. But what new knowledge did you create about grief through that particular process? So they describe findings and outcomes and outputs. So it's literally a narrative arc.
That new knowledge, can that be quite personal knowledge in the context of your practice, or does it have to be an academic knowledge as such? Is there a tension there in terms of artistic practice and academic research?
I mean, we had this pro forma, like just a Word document that people completed to produce these. And at the top of it was the Research England definition of what research is. A process of investigation leading to new insights or new knowledge, effectively shared.
Right, okay.
And I think the effectively shared part of it is my answer to your question just now. So I don't think it's about personal knowledge and findings. I also don't think it's necessarily about academic knowledge and findings, because the effectively shared part of it is about audience. Like, who are you doing this research for, and with whom are you sharing what you're finding out? And we're all finding things out by making. So through this process of making, what have you found out, and who are you sharing that with? So I think it transcends. It kind of doesn't transcend. These are rooted in academia, but they really extend, like the projects and the research inquiries extend far beyond academia, like I think a lot of practice research does. And thank you so much.
That's okay. It's very interesting to listen to you both. I'm just interested in what you said earlier about the practice research, and actually this now as well, the definition of research. Do you think, because you talked about the tension of the art piece at the end of it needing to be of good quality, or can practice research focus on just the process, and therefore the new knowledge be about the process, and you can then obviously share that in a dissemination, conference, presentation, whatever. So can the project be about the process rather than about the beautiful outcome?
Yeah, definitely. There are several people at Central. There's a cohort of practice researchers, and I kind of lead activities and development activities with that cohort. And several people within that group use practice as part of their methodology, but they publish in journal articles, book chapters, and monographs. So I think specifically I'm thinking about researchers who are publishing in non-textual forms, publishing in the form of a performance, or publishing in the form of a painting or a composition. But of course, yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I can't remember whether just now I used the word quality. I think I've definitely used the word good. And actually, I don't think quality is the thing that I think is so significant. I think makers and artists and practitioners are following through an idea until it feels complete. And something being complete doesn't always rarely shows actually how you got there. And often, and I think this is different in different fields of practice, so I think practice research also happens in medicine. I think it's not only creative or arts-based or media-based, but I think often, certainly within the arts, often artists want things to not be concealed, but for the viewer to have to work at an artwork to try and draw out what it might be meaning. Whereas what research is supposed to do is go, look, here's some new knowledge, and that's a tension definitely that exists. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Academy has found practice research a little bit too complicated until relatively recently. Right?
Also, that the way you frame that, there's a sense also that perhaps one of the things that the audience don't want to know is how you made it. They're not interested in how you made it. They want to experience what you've made, and so the process is, in a way, something that's for the makers that might be extrapolated in terms of research, but has very little to do with the audience experience, other than the fact you've created something and it may have a certain kind of quality. So in some ways, there's if you're writing a paper, you have a method section, and it lays out what your methods. But when you're creating artistic practice, that is hidden from the audience as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, just on that point, sorry to interrupt, but I think isn't method sometimes demonstrated, particularly in performance, in things such as program notes? And I think I know certainly when I've been to see shows and what have you, that I am interested in knowing a bit more about the backstory of production. And I imagine in case of theatre, it's the case that program notes would be included in...
For sure. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, please, it's good.
Let's what were the challenges in creating this from a institutional perspective, from a creative perspective, from a academic? What were the challenges in kind of coming from this idea to these final boxes?
This whole approach was, come and join us.
Come have a look at the box.
I'm not letting anyone touch them until after we finish talking, so then everyone will stop listening. I've totally lost my thread.
What
Sorry.
were the challenges?
The challenges.
Specific challenges in bringing this to fruition.
These were a really intentional, strategic investment by Central, an investment of labour and an investment of money. I think one of the challenges was around the labour the amount of labour that had to go into producing these things. The amount of time it took to write this text, the amount of time it took to develop and assemble everything that was inside the box and on the USB. This is another thing where practice research can feel so different from written text-based research and publishing, because these three projects, a performance piece, a collection of clothing, and a strange interdisciplinary multi-species studio, they were all really substantial projects that took a lot of time, resource, money, people, collaboration, partners to bring into being, and they're all research projects. So I did all of that, and that was my research. And then I had to do all of this all over again. So I think that one of the biggest challenges was, because this was the first time we'd done it, in preparing for the ref submission, some researchers at Central are going, so my book's been published, and others are doing this. So that disparity was very difficult to navigate, and I'll be really honest, there was a lot of negativity around it, because we didn't know whether it was going to be worth all of that effort. Everyone was really happy when they got these things, to represent their project, and we printed an extra set for all of the researchers to have as like calling cards for their projects. So that there was that. The challenge of the labour of having to represent practice research in these kind of technical settings like REF, which want something so specific. Institutionally, the labour, but they were a really huge financial investment. I think Central invested about £50,000.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
And that was what, 20, how many were there? 20 or so?
There were 18. There were 11, at that point, there were 11 practice researchers, and we made 18 of these.
And it was about 50, so that's...
About 50.
Let's do the sums, it's around...
Because graphic design is crazy expensive when you work with good graphic
couple
designers.
grand each at least.
Yeah,
minimum.
minimum. And already at Central we're saying, well, we can't make that, we can't afford to make that investment again for REF 2029. So we're thinking of a different process. But it was I think I'm probably jumping to a different question, but it was a really intentional strategic investment that our Vice Principal for Research, Maria Delgado, just had a hunch that if we found a way of presenting Central's practice research to REF 2021, it could score really highly, and that could reap really great rewards, financial rewards.
That brings us to the next question. How did the REF panel respond to the boxes?
Yeah, I mean, the feedback is strange, isn't it? Because it's quite a superficial kind of summary feedback. Central far exceeded our expectations, and frankly every other institution's expectations of Central in our result. In the feedback from REF, the practice research, the strength of the practice research submission was mentioned. So I think it did, like, that strategic investment paid off. I think it made a huge difference to our result. They also, in the feedback, did question whether this level of kind of narrating a project was necessary. When all they wanted was a 300-word statement, did we really have to make a 5,000-page booklet? Well, you know, I guess you're reading the monographs, so it's not that. It's quite thin, right, compared to a.
It is about 6,000 words, so it's the length of a paper, really.
Yeah. And sorry, I'm kind of being slightly. I am being sarcastic, but. They recognised the impact of this approach because they recognised the value, the quality of the practice research. I think they were surprised that an institution had gone to this length to tell the story around practice research. And to be honest, I think it did something really specific for Central, and that was great. And now all the practice researchers have got lots of funding to spend on their next projects because we pulled it in. So it's great. But I think like just the fact that I'm here talking with you about it, and I keep being invited to go and talk about this with different people. I think it's just opened some questions about how we do this.
Right, yeah.
And I'm certainly not suggesting that this is correct in any sort of way, that this is what anybody else should be doing. It worked for us in that moment as a strategic experiment. But I think it's opened up a lot of very good and important questions around practice research, shareability, legibility, accessibility.
Mm-hmm. So I was going to ask, what are the benefits to the researchers, and that you've kind of said that it's basically pulled in lots more funding, so that kind of has a direct correlation between the submission. Mm-hmm. I guess the challenge there is that when did you start at what point in time in that cycle had you identified those researchers that were being submitted, and how long was it before they actually saw money come back in from that? I imagine that's quite a long timeline.
Yeah, I think, when did we start working on these? I think we started to ask people to begin to write the sort of narratives. 2018.
Right.
And of course, some people, it all happened later because, of course, you know, the census period went later than that. So there were projects right at the end of the period that came online. But yeah, we started in 2018. So then when were they submitted? The end of 2020. And it's really in the last academic year, I would say. Yeah.
So it's
So
about a 6 year
year
cycle before the money starts to roll in from the benefit of it. But even so, that's still significant because those people are now benefiting, I see.
Yeah. And it's interesting, with Ref 21, there were 11 practice researchers. For Ref 29, there are already 25.
Right.
Like a lot of people have come to Central. Practice researchers have kind of seen Central as a place where practice research is really valued and supported. So that's one of the reasons why we're not doing this again.
Can't keep taking people in yet.
And also I can't guide that many people through this, with multiple projects. So.
But that's a definite indicator of success, isn't it, really, I think. So so that's obviously there's an institutional benefit, but that's also brought on board an institutional constraint because they obviously feel that they're now at a limit, can't kind of expand. Are there any sort of key takeaways? Because we'll talk a bit in a minute about what you might do differently, because you're obviously already thinking about that. But what key takeaways? Are there maybe one or two things that are really significant about this that you'd like to share with the people here?
I mean, I think it's this. I think it's this active storytelling around a project, which has a double benefit, I think, of in the context of something like REF or anything equivalent, it just makes a research process really visible, really legible, and it can demonstrate the rigor of that process, and it can demonstrate the significance of that research. It's a very simple but very effective way of narrating research, which sometimes is not narrated through the practice itself. And so then the other benefit is that it allows the practice just to be the practice. Right. If that makes sense. Like the practice doesn't need to demonstrate its research questions, because this tells you what the research questions are. Yeah. When we opened these pop-up shops for this grief thing, we didn't have our research questions on any of the t-shirts, so I think that's the thing, and I'm not, absolutely not suggesting that I think that that's an ideal thing. I think we're in a transition where practice research is being increasingly recognised. AHRC is talking about it a lot, and hopefully going to start significantly supporting it even more than it has been. I fundamentally believe, actually, I mean, this is where my role at Central and my kind of, in a way, my beliefs as an artist slightly diverge, because I believe that art, performance, dance, painting, video, audio, whatever, I think they all inherently are forms of knowledge. They're not ways of communicating knowledge, they are knowledge. Like they're embodied knowledges, they're visual knowledges, they're sonic knowledges. And so ultimately what I think I would hope for, radical hope, is that somehow everyone gets better at understanding how to read those knowledges, rather than them having to come back into writing. But for the purposes of this, we brought them back into writing for a particular reason, and as I've said, it was a strategic decision. But does that make sense?
That's really, really valuable. So let's, before we share them with people, what is your thinking now? Because clearly the institution said, no, we can't afford to do that. We can't keep bringing on thousands of new researchers. Mm-hmm. So what you're thinking now? What's the new approach? How are you innovating around this?
I mean, we're still doing this. So if we may or may not print them, it might be that we make PDFs. I mean, in the absence of any REF guidelines, when do they publish them? 2030? We don't know. We don't know whether everything has to be submitted digitally or not.
Yes.
So we may print the booklets. We may just make digital PDFs. But that we're kind of focusing on that at the moment, and just that. For all the reasons that I just said, actually, I think it just works. It's so obvious. Like, it's just about supporting people to have the time. And that's something else that we maybe ought to talk about, or we could talk about if you think it's useful, like how the institution supports people to have the time to do all of this.
Right.
Because it takes a lot of time. And I talked about one of the challenges being that additional labour, and nobody was expecting everyone to do that labour just on top of their existing full-time job. So there were things that were put in place to help
And is that
with that.
happening now? Is there
Yeah.
time being set aside?
Yeah, there is. In lots of different ways. Sometimes through obvious things like sabbaticals and research leave, but also through lots of peer mentoring and the kind of structures of support. And there were 2 practice researchers who, for different reasons to do with neurodivergence, found it almost impossible to write about their practice in this way. And so we paid for an interlocutor for one of them and effectively a ghostwriter for the other one, who they spoke and then somebody else wrote the booklet for them. And so there's things like that, just really practical things like that, just to help people.
The booklet, I mean, it's around 6,000 words. It's kind of, in some ways, it's like a journal article. What's difference between this and a published journal article? Were they peer reviewed, for example?
Well, this is a really good question. They were peer reviewed. The booklets were peer reviewed. This is a thing, isn't it? And we're talking about this at the moment at Central. There's such a very established system for peer reviewing published writing, which happens before the writing gets published. So the review happens and then it goes out into the world. But with practice research, usually what happens is that it goes out into the world and then it gets reviewed. So it's literally the other way around. And so then with something like this, so we've had the project, we've had the practice research, it's already happened in the past. It wasn't peer reviewed, unless, I mean, sometimes it was because maybe it had been funded through AHRC or through Wellcome Trust, the certain funders, or other contexts where there may be a peer review process built in, which happened before the practice happened. But generally I think not, because mostly I think it's happening in sort of professional contexts where people are practitioners and not in those systems of peer review. So the practice itself didn't get peer reviewed, and then we make these narratives that describe it, and these did get peer reviewed. So that's a very strange process, because then it becomes about the quality of the storytelling. What's being peer reviewed is the quality of the storytelling in the booklets.
Right, yeah.
Because no one's going to say, oh, you ought to have done that. We suggest that you edit your performance text like this. Yeah, because it's too late now, it's already happened. Do you know what I mean? So I think it would be really great, I don't know if anyone else has got any thoughts, but I think the question of peer review around practice research is really complex, and maybe more or less complex in different settings, because maybe in medicine, peer review is absolutely embedded in all practice research. But in my context, theatre and performance, again, going back to what I was saying before, where the practitioner is really focused on making, how could it sit in that context, I think is a question.
Well, we had a presentation from Screenworks about peer review, and they have a very similar idea that in a way, it's nice if the peer review process does change, and sometimes it does change the film, but very often it doesn't, because it's maybe published. But the peer review is a process of dialogue between, they only write a 1,500 word statement, but there's a process of peer review and dialogue which then rewrites that statement, and so it's a dialogue about the methodology and the research and articulating the research. So there's definitely, I think, value there, because this is something I'm struggling with at the moment. It's like I'm just about to put on an event. How do you get it peer reviewed? Unless those peer reviewers can come and experience it, there's no real way that they could really make a judgment of it. Plus, as we've been discussing, the methodology of the research may not be evident in the performance, because we don't necessarily see a need for the audience to engage with that. So let us. Should we open it up and share the boxes with people? Literally open them up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think no, not at all. I mean, they're good. They're good looking, but they're also really very, very simple. So they're not precious at all. So no gloves needed. Thank you. Do you want to slide them around for me, please?